Okay, so just welcome everyone to this sixth session in our conversations on public communication and climate change. So, which is a series of just sort of informal conversations with various stakeholders and people interested in ecology and climate science, in particular, interested in how you publicly communicate these things in ways that are efficient, and what you can do, what strategies you can adopt in order to better communicate science that is concerned with these issues. So for this particular session here, we're going to talk with Anne-Laure Boyer, and Anne-Laure is a CNRS postdoctoral researcher at a place called iGlobes, which is sort of an international research lab, which is also interdisciplinary, which was founded in 2008 as an agreement between the University of Arizona and the French National Center for Scientific Research, and which is then a French research center which is placed at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And the reason why I have invited Lisa to come and speak with us about what she's doing is because she co-wrote an article that I read some time ago called "Building Consensus: The Production of Water Conservation Discourse Through Twitter, the Water Use It Wisely campaign in Arizona," which came out in a journal called Environmental Communication in 2021. And which is a splendid piece of work, which is concerned with the ways with a particular water management project. She will tell us about it herself, perhaps more precisely how that project worked, but also how where they use Twitter to communicate about using water resources. So that's the thing we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the use of social media, and in particular about the use of Twitter in relation to questions of conservation. The way we will go about it is that we'll just take the usual format for those who've been here before. First, I'm just going to let Anne-Laure tell a little bit about herself and about the work that she's done, and then also about this particular article and about the work they did and the methodology they followed and the result they obtained. And then we're going to move on and talk a little bit more about the issues that this raised, sort of more general issues about conservation issues and public communication. So Anne-Laure, I'm just going to let you talk for a little while, and then we'll come back to the questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this introduction. So yes, I'm a postdoc at the CNRS, and I'm working right now at the iGlobes lab at the University of Arizona. So it's a French-American lab, and I'm working for the network of human environment observatories funded by the CNRS and the LabX DREAM. And we're studying right now socio-hydrosystems that have been disturbed by huge environmental events. So in the case of the OHM Pima County, it's the case study is the Santa Cruz River. It's an intermittent river of southern Arizona that has been dried up since the 1940s because of overexploitation, overpumping for mining, agricultural, and urban water uses. So this is what I'm doing right now. And what we're going to talk about today is what I was doing when I was working on my PhD. So a PhD in geography, where I was studying how big cities can adapt to climate change, and especially to water scarcity. So the goal of that research was to assess and to explore first all the strategies that cities can implement to adapt to a world of less water. And the case studies were Tucson in southern Arizona and Phoenix, which is very close to Tucson. It's also in a semi-arid environment. And Phoenix was a very interesting case because it's now the 5th biggest city in the US. One of those strategies was water conservation. And water conservation is how to manage demand, and especially how to change people's behavior regarding water and water uses. So there are two parts in water conservation. The first one is the technical part. So I didn't study that aspect that much. It's technical fixes, fixing leaks, upgrading the whole network of pipes that is supplying the city, etc. And the other aspect is public outreach, water education, environmental education, and awareness campaigns to try to convince people to use less water. So when I got to my fieldwork the first time, you could see in both cities, there were a lot of advertisement on that matter, like huge billboards, for instance, that were promoting water conservation. Also radio spots, TV spots. Everywhere in the city, you could see signs that were promoting water conservation. But then I also turned to the press first to see how the press was talking about all this issue. Was it a daily issue? Are people in Arizona talking every day about the fact that water is becoming scarce? And from the press, I turned to new media, which are social media, to see who is talking about this. Is it a big discussion? Is there a debate on the question that water are scarce or not? How are people dealing with this, etc.? And at that time, it was under the Trump presidency. So that's also why I thought that Twitter was maybe the best fieldwork that I could explore online. So because of former President Trump, and also because Twitter is about talking. You on that network, on that social media to talk. So what are people talking about when they're talking about water and water scarcity and water conservation? And that's how I found out about this very big campaign that City of Phoenix and other municipalities in the metro area were running online that was called Water Use It Wisely. And the question was, what are they saying to try to convince people to use less water in a whole context of Arizona, where it's the land of plenty, it's the American West, we're in the desert, but the cities look like luxurious oases with golf courses, pools, a lot of lawns, everything is green. So in that context, also of the land of the free, like the land of plenty and the land of the free, Arizona, how do you convince people to use less? And how can you build a consensus around this idea that there is less water and we need to face that politically, but also culturally, and change the lifestyle that people have in this desert. So that was what we were trying to explore with that question and that fieldwork online. And so I worked with a data scientist. So all the technical work that was made on Twitter to gather all this information was done by a data scientist. And we web scraped, we worked with Twitter API to collect data. I also went to meet with the people in charge of the campaign, and they gave me access to all the tweets they had produced since 2008. So that we could study the text. And we were mostly interested in the text. What are they saying and how and who is it reaching? So the methods that we used, it's not big data, it's more like quantitative textual analysis. What do they say? How do they say it? So we used lexicometric softwares to try to assess what are the most used words. And what was very interesting is that the data scientists managed to web scrap the profile description of people who were following and interacting with that campaign online to try to see who they were reaching. And that's where it becomes really interesting, because that's where we could see that there was a lot of water professionals, but there were also lay people or activists with a vocabulary that was very intense on environmental issues. So that's.
So would you say that of this survey that you made of what happened with this campaign, would you say that that was the most significant discovery or most significant thing that you found out from this concerns, to say, the user distribution, that you had mainly professionals and then some intense activists on it? Is that sort of the main thing you figured out, or?
I think to me it was kind of the main thing, because so what I was also doing, I was doing a lot of participant observation, and I was going to almost all the workshops that the local institutions were holding to talk about water. And when I was going to those places, there were not that many people very often. And also it was very hard to me as a French young researcher here to manage to access lay people. What do the average inhabitant of Phoenix or Tucson think about all this? Mm-hmm. When I saw that on Twitter, there were accounts like those that were following water use it wisely, to me was really completing what I was doing on the participant observation side. And also, I think, again, since we were like during the Trump presidency, I think I was kind of looking for conflicts and discussion and like heated debates online. So see that there were those what we could qualify like intense profile activists. They qualify themselves as, I don't know, believers. They are enthusiastic about saving water, or they're conservative and they're Trump voters. So I found that was very interesting.
So would you say, in terms of the distribution of the users that you had, that it was in terms of, do you have a sense of how whether the campaign worked as it was intended to? I mean, was the campaign at the outset, I presume, was mainly aimed at the sort of average Joe, so the sort of layman, as you call them, and people who are not scientists. But that didn't seem to be the case. I mean, it seems to be sort of a mixture and a fairly large group of people who were professionals. I mean, it was kind of funny way that you described the professionals, because it's it runs the gamut from the plumbers to the all the way up to the sort of super specialized scientists, what you call professionals. But in any case, a kind of very heterogeneous community of people who work professionally with water. And that raises some questions. I mean, one of the things that I was interested in hearing more about is that so that Twitter's campaign, the kind of information that was sent out was mainly aimed at people sort of doing everyday things. So it was more so it was a public communication campaign. But when it ends up being the case that perhaps half or more than half of the people who respond to the campaign are professionals, then it becomes another kind of provision, right? Now it's no longer a public communication campaign. Now it's more like an open science provision. It's more about, communicating whatever data or scientific discoveries you have or whatever to a wider scientific community. So was there any sort of adjustment made along the way to account for the fact that maybe the users that you had, that there were on that campaign, that responded to the campaign, maybe didn't exactly correspond to the sort of the audience from the outset? Have you ever any sense of that? I mean, would you say that the people who created the campaign, given the kind of response that they got and the activity that you elicited on Twitter, did they feel that it was a success or not?
So I think they love presenting this campaign as a success, of course, because they're also spending a lot of money in it, because they hired a marketing company to do it. And it's public money. So, but Yeah, no, I think they are not reaching their goal, and I think they know it. From what I've seen, I think they consider that it's the first step. Because, for instance, like you were saying, it's very interesting, this wide range of water professionals that are the main group that is interacting with the campaign, because it goes from the Arizona Department of Water Resources to plumbing companies. So I think for them, it's the first step is convincing, having all the professionals on board and convince them that the main tool that we need to use right now to deal with water scarcity is water conservation. It's not anymore water supply management. So we need to stop building dams, basically, to focus on fixing leaks, providing smart water controllers so that people are not irrigating nonstop their lawns, providing, I don't know, drip irrigation systems. So that's when you get the plumbers on board, because you need their company to promote the installation of xeriscaping and smart irrigation system at the household scale, but also at the public park scales, etc. So I think that's where they are the first step. And maybe the second step is, how can we reach the rest of the people?
Yeah. So you say first step and second step. So another thing, which is there was in the article as you presented it, there was some information about how water use had diminished in Arizona previous to the campaign. So I presume there have been other kinds of campaigns and other kinds of initiatives like it, and it was really quite impressive in many ways. From what I can't remember exactly what, you would correct me if I'm exaggerating or not giving the right numbers, but it was something like, from 1980 up until now, the use of water per individual in that area had fallen from something like 1,000 liters a day to 400 or something like that. So cut by 60%, which is enormous already, isn't it? So they must have a sense that, is that because of public campaigns, or is that just sort of central water management that has done that? Is there a public conscience sort of scenario involved, do you think? Or so you have a sense that it actually works?
So they have to do it. That's also something that I forgot to precise for people who don't know Arizona. But so since 1980, there is a law that they have to do this. They have to curb how much water people are using.
Okay.
So by law, they were kind of required to launch this campaign. It didn't have to be that big, but they have to show the Arizona Department of Water Resources, but also the federal government, that they are working on that issue.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why at the beginning of the 1980s, they had to start a lot of different strategies. And the main one was water conservation, to do this, to decrease the amount of water that was used by the city. So what they did first is they started transforming any public area into a more desert adapted landscape. So for instance, if you look at satellite pictures of Phoenix in the 70s and now, you can see how the city is way less green than it used to be.
Yeah.
It was 80% of public areas were grass and lawns, and now it's only 14%, for instance. So that's how they could decrease the amount of water that was used by the city a lot, because here they count that it's between 50 and 70% of your water bill that goes to outdoor uses for maintaining your yard.
Absolutely enormous. I didn't realize it was that much. So that means that when they are targeting individual citizens, they're starting to work on the margins, actually, on what can be saved, because it's mainly public. But in the end of the day, it's public works that take up the majority of all this. I mean, in many ways, it's kind of encouraging, because it means that that a lot of these conservation issues can simply be solved very easily politically, can't they? Because you don't need to have people do anything. You can just take the decision down at the city hall, can't you? And change a lot of things. So how did you consider, this campaign to be something that, so I presume they're still working on that. So this is sort of to start to target individual citizens. How much impact will that have in that kind of scenario? Is it, as I say, just working on the margins, say, or could it potentially really change things?
Maybe it's a mix of the two, because so the issue, and to go back to the open science aspect of this campaign, the issue is that even though they are doing so many efforts, it's still a situation of shortage, and it's getting worse and worse. Like right now, for instance, in the news, it's every day there is something about the level of Lake Mead, which is the main reservoir. It's only 30% full. Next year, we're going to start having cutbacks. So next year, maybe we're going to have restrictions in Arizona, which is something new, because unless it's very different from California. In California, when they don't have enough water, they just say restrictions. You can't clean your car, you can't water your yard, etc. Here, they're so proud in Arizona that they don't have restrictions, but they're coming. So the issue is, and I think the goal of this campaign is to show that even though water conservation seems not to be working because we're still not avoiding the shortage situation, we need to keep that as the main tool. And in order to make it work, we need everyone on board, and we need the individuals and the private households.
So the funny thing here is that one thing is, it seems like campaigns like these, if they reach the general population, it seems like they have like two objectives at the same time. On the one hand, they have the objection of making individual citizens take short showers or whatever. They're sort of making individual efforts. And most people will realize that, you know, that they take a shorter shower is not going to change a whole lot. I mean, that's not going to. And then there's the other thing, which is the more you inform about this, the more they are, the more they know that it is a problem, the more they are willing to put political pressure on their own representatives. So it becomes sort of a public campaign, is a double campaign, as it were. It is targeting individual citizens, but is also targeting individual citizens so that individual citizens may target politicians. So it's like a triangular thing going on here. And in that relation, there was this notion that came up, and which was perhaps the one that I found most interesting about the article. So towards the end, there came up this notion that came from various people about using social media, and also about how conservation strategies could be depoliticized, as you called it. And this notion of depoliticization was kind of surprising to me, because you read through the thing, and then you read that, okay, there is a risk that the use of Twitter to communicate about water scarcity will involve depoliticization of the problem. And I said, what? How did that happen? That anything that has to do, and of course, when you think Twitter and you think communication of Twitter, you can't think of a medium that is any more politicized than that. But what you actually meant by it was this idea that you start targeting individual citizens has the effect of, as it were, taking the moral pressure off the policymakers and putting all the moral pressure on the individual citizens. So it's no longer up to the policymakers to set up the price of water or impose local bans, so you can't water your lawn, but put all the responsibility on the individual citizens. So that's one of the things I wanted to hear more about, what you think about that, this kind of weird, paradox between using Twitter and social media for this, where it at the same time depoliticizes in terms of moral responsibility, but also has enormous potential of politicizing the things, because as we all know, whatever you say on Twitter will immediately weaponized ideologically. So you can see, you know, people will start, you know, taking longer showers because it's for, you know, Trump will probably like that or something like that because it's the Republican thing to do or the free thing to do. And now I'm going to show my liberty and I'm going to take a very long shower. So what do you think about this whole political situation?
Yes, it's very interesting. Also because the few lay people that we managed to see through that analysis, they were actually intense people. So either vegan or saying they were super liberal, health enthusiastic, and on the other side, Trump voters and conservative, etc. So the few lay people we had, they were very politicized and they were very intense, let's say. But on the other hand, you could see that the message that was being spread by water usage wisely is so standardized. They are not, so they are sharing facts about drought, like evidence of drought. So there is a drought, so you guys need to spend less water. But they were also sharing a lot of conservation tips. They were very basics, and that was most of the tweets, they are actually conservation tips.
Okay.
So, and then they had all these followers that were everywhere in the world. So it was so standardized that anyone in South Africa or in Australia, or I think even in South America, I think there were people in the UK that were following the campaign because those messages are so standardized that you can use them everywhere where there are water scarcity issues and where people speak English, I guess. So that was the first aspect that I think was a little bit depoliticizing the situation, is that even though they were also tweeting on water scarcity issues in the Southwest, in the Colorado River watershed, they were emitting messages that could be used anywhere. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing, of course, is what you were saying, that by doing this, they were basically saying, okay, you inhabitants of those cities are responsible for this situation, and it's on you to kind of try to fix it. It's not on us. While here in Arizona, it's so, for instance, if you take the city of Phoenix, it's urban sprawl as best. It's crazy. It's huge, the city, everything is horizontal. It's only individual houses and it's still growing. It's the fastest growing city in the US. So for instance, to use less water, they could pass a law that you can't spread the city more. That's it. We've reached the limits. Stop building suburbs. But I don't want to do this. Or the other issue also is the city surrounded by fields, cotton fields, alfalfa fields.
Oh God, yeah.
So they could also pass a law saying, okay, we stop doing this. We're not allowing irrigated crops anymore so that we can focus on the water that we have. So there is this big debate, and it's been going on since the 60s, because the first water scarcity issue and the first shortage that affected the cities here in Arizona was in the 70s. So there is like the true, or people that consider themselves as true environmentalists here in Arizona, they're against sprawl and they're against urban growth. But this campaign and the way they talk about conservation in this campaign is more about, let's save water so that we can keep the economy going as it is. So
I think you're touching upon the, let's say, the imperative of growth in a US context anywhere is probably a no-go. I mean it's even a no-go in France, isn't it? I mean, you cannot. I mean, it's a big conservation issue. I presume, you know, you can just stop growing and, you know, things will be fine. But that's not really an option, is it? Yeah. So I think it's striking that this has been going on since the 60s. I mean, this has been going on for so long. So already in the 60s, you could already predict that there wouldn't be enough water already at that time.
So yes, and also that's why building the consensus is also very important, is because actually there are books now and very serious research that show that since the 1920s, when the signed the sharing of the Colorado River, they already knew there was science there that was showing that it was not going to be enough for the 7 states, enough water in the Colorado River. They didn't want to see those data. They took the data of a wet year that was showing that it was a lot of water in the Colorado, and that's how they decided to share it among themselves, the 7 Western states. And now they are bringing back all this, and they are researchers that have been digging the archives and everything to find those data that were showing that since the 1920s, they knew, they just didn't want to.
This was going to be a problem. Yeah, yeah, it's incredible, huh? The lack of foresight. So one of the things that comes out, so when you call your article Building Consensus, I mean, one of the things that are kind of interesting that comes out of this is that if you actually want to build consensus, you can only stick it so deep, as it were. And you can only, that's also actually something that came out of the conversation we had just a week ago with Freya Bamberg about Copernicus and about, you know, how they use weather data to communicate about general climate change. Is that if you want to give out a consensual message, or give out a message that is something that you can build a consensus around, is that what you can do best is that you don't of course communicate raw data, because you know that's too complicated and stuff, but also you don't really communicate knowledge or information about the interpretation of those data. But what you do best when you try to sort of make consensus building in the public sphere is that you communicate user tips, which is exactly what you just said as well. It cannot not necessarily just user tips, you know, just, you know, turn off your water while you put soap on your hands or whatever. But engaging with the public in a user way, say you can use this information for this or that, rather than scaring people off with information about what the consequences of it will be if they don't do it. I think that's kind of an interesting upshot of at least these 2 last conversations that we've had, that consensus building about conservation and climate change issues is best achieved when you focus on very concrete initiatives about what do you do as individuals or as policymakers or whatever. You don't say what the consequences are, but you say what can we do about it right now, and that is simple and implementable. So yeah, I don't know what you think about that, you know, the sort of user perspective on communication as a kind of a strategy of communicating stuff, because we've been through all kinds of way of communicating stuff via direct experience, or via screenwriting, or via history, and this what's one thing that sort of emerges here is the idea that you can communicate knowledge via user tips. Yeah.
No, yes, it's very also because when we didn't write anything about that, but we also looked at the pictures that were shared on Twitter, on that Twitter feed of water.
Yeah, nice, yeah.
And for instance, so the main reservoir here, it's Lake Mead on the Colorado River. So what they do here is that they don't talk about climate change that much, because it's the background trend, but that could bring a lot also of reactions that they don't want to see, they don't want to hear, they don't want to put that into discussion. So what they do is when they want to talk about the level of Lake Mead, they regularly post a picture of the lake where it's so obvious that it's going down, because you have this white like band, like it looks like a bathtub that is going down, you know. So they show this and they say, today the level of Lake Mead is at that level, and then they go on with the conservation tips.
Yeah.
When people have this image, it's whatever, if it's climate change or not, we can see that our main reservoir is low. It's so obvious on that picture. So let's see what they are telling us to do. So
yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. Also, it makes me think of another thing like that worked really well in another area of the world. I'm thinking about the Lake of Galilee in Israel. So, but perhaps you know that for decades, the Lake of Galilee was the only freshwater reservoir that the state of Israel had after its foundation, until they started building big water desalination plants along the coast. But what you did have that taught these Israelis are very good at irrigation systems and things like that, of course, but they're also very good at managing on the level of, I mean, it's sort of a public thing that everybody knows is something you have to be careful with. Why? Well, because it was told to them constantly. If you go, I actually think it's still the case. You would go and see the Jerusalem Post, and you will see on the weather charts, they would also always indicate the water level of the Lake of Galilee. It's just became sort of a part of the public discourse that you speak about the weather and you speak, does it rain, doesn't it rain, what is the water level in the Lake of Galilee? So it became sort of part of the general public thing without ever mentioning anything about climate change or even necessarily conservationist issues, but it was simply sort of a practical issue about irrigation. So that seems to be the right strategy. It's a little bit underhanded, isn't it? Because they never say, you don't say what the underlying reason is ever, do you?
But at the beginning, my approach was, so because I had this whole political ecology approach, I was very critique of what they were doing.
Yeah, but maybe it's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I just realized also by spending more time in Arizona, I was like, but they don't have a choice because it's so polarized politically that if they start talking about topics, they have a tag on them. Oh, this is a Democrat topic. Those liberals, they believe in environmental issues and they believe in climate change. Then that will mess up their whole efforts because what they want is to have everyone on board. So they have no other choice than to have this standardized, like kind of weak sustainability message, not to scare anyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think they're just being very practical.
Yes, yeah, yeah, and that often seems to be the best strategy when I talk to people. I mean, they're trying to be very practical about it when it works. Anyway, so I think so. We've gotten it now. It's 5:40, and I think usually when we get to this point, we sort of open up to general discussion with people who are in the audience. So at this point, I wanted to ask if there's anyone among the two that we have here who would like to ask a question or discuss further, or have a comment or anything of the things we talked about until now. Yes, so Anne, by you.
Yes, thank you for this talk and this discussion. It's really super interesting. I have one question, maybe it's a bit methodological, but you mentioned that your data scientists web scraped actually only Twitter, and especially the people interacting with the campaign. Could you be a little more specific about what you mean with the interaction? Because my point is that there are not that many people on Twitter, but you can, use Twitter posts in Facebook posts, etc., and have like other social media relay on it. So depending on who you want to reach, Twitter might be a starting point for other type of social media. And could you get a grasp on that, on the way it's spreaded? Or, I mean, not just on Twitter, but over Twitter.
We really focused on Twitter only, because what happened also with specifically that campaign, I don't know about other Twitter feed. So all the tweets they had that were referring to other social medias, especially YouTube or even Facebook, or that were referring to events or websites that they were sending the reader to, those had no success. They had 1 like or maybe 2. So that's why we decided not to really study these links that they can create between other platforms. And we only focused on their tweets. So we had their tweets from 2016 to 2018 with all the links that go behind it. And we also I had their entire tweets feed from 2008 to 2018, but that was an Excel file. So that was only like textual data. So it was not very useful. So the study, the data set that we used for the article in environmental communication was based on the tweets that we could collect through the API, so that we had more metadata on the tweets. And then the web scraping thing, we did it on the profiles of people that were following Water Use It Wisely and that were being followed by them also. So like their friends and their followers. And the main goal actually was a geographical objective, was to use web scraping and textual analysis to be able to have a broader set of data that we could have run through like a like the goal, because so, you know, a lot of people can put their location on their Twitter profile, but actually I think it's 1 or 2% of Twitter users that do that. And we wanted to find a way that we could have a bigger data set with geographical information like that. So that's why we started doing the web scraping on the profile to see if they were saying anything about where they live in the text. And we found cities, we found countries. And that's where I couldn't do that at all. That's where the data scientist step in and is able to do this. And we have maps where you can see where the followers are located. But it's not based on something it's not based on the location tool of Twitter. It's based on what they were saying in the profile description.
Okay, so you didn't take into account, for instance, the retweets or the likes? It's just the followers.
No, yes. So what we did though is we look at the tweets that were the most liked and the most retweeted, and we try to assess what they were about. So yes, that's what we did.
And which ones were sort of the ones that were most liked and most most retweeted? Which ones were they?
So the ones that we're talking about how you can save money by saving water.
Okay, so practical tips about saving money. Okay, that is not surprising, unfortunately.
But it was also very interesting, this part, because when you say water conservation, of course, there is this aspect of water saving and making savings by using less water. But the word conservation, if you use it in an environmental context, you know, it also means like saving nature and rescuing nature. Mm-hmm. But how they approach water conservation here in Arizona, it's not that much about saving water for the sake of the environment. It's more about saving water so we have enough to live in this.
For economic growth, as you said before. Yeah. So it's not considered. So it's not at all being publicized as an environmental issue. I mean, at all.
Not at all, but I think because I'm still following them, I think they are starting to do this. Mm-hmm. But I think because it's also more in the air maybe now to, you know, save water for the environment and the good health of the ecosystems. Mm. But yes, at the time of the survey, it was not really.
That was not really an issue. Okay. That's striking. Do we have more questions?
Yeah. Maybe I have a comment. So I'm very interested by the question asked by Anne about the methodology of the sort of digital humanities use of social media, because when Anne-Lise and the co-authors started this project, we had this hypothesis that it could be interesting to use Twitter to sort of uncover a certain number of processes shaping opinion regarding environmental change in general, and from our perspective, the attempt we had on using Twitter was quite successful in terms of richness of data we could extract to the feed. But the perhaps one more step would be to try to link, yes, several social media and perhaps extending from water conservation to other types of conservation topics in general, or environmental topics. So I know that Anne-Lise now has moved to other topics, but perhaps there is room for a network interested in using more all the resources provided by social media to better understand the role they play in combating climate change or environmental change. Because one question which is asked many times by climate specialists or biodiversity specialists is, how can we translate what we want to do better and make it more understandable for a larger public. And I think that social media is really the place where a lot of things happens in terms of passing messages, in terms of water conservation, like Anne-Lise showed us, but also it's the place where people are fighting against the ideas of climate change and resisting the necessity of starting to make happening changes. And so, my intuition is that we have still, there are a lot of work been done already on social media and environment, and the way the paper was quoted by several other studies already showed that. But I think that there is many more perhaps studies to do and an extension of this work to be done through networks, and perhaps it would be worth investigating if in the digital humanities community there would be more people interesting to join environmental geographers on topics like that.
Yeah, I think so. At least from here, I think that's absolutely true. Also, if you look at from the point of view of philosophers, and philosophers in particular who work on things like network theory and things like that, how these things are constituted. I mean, of course, there are all kinds of very interesting conceptual paradoxes that comes out of the fact that social media and Twitter in particular are places where knowledge are produced based almost exclusively on the authority of the speakers. What is it that makes information that circulates on Twitter being perceived as being reliable? And it's the greatest indicator of reliability of information via that medium is the original place where the tweet came from. So you have to sort of track a tweet through the retweets back to the original authoritative source, as it were, and people tend not to do that on Twitter. So because of the whole retweet mechanism, it's a very dangerous medium to play around with if you want to communicate things about, especially about climate science, where the science itself is so immensely complex that what really matters for the knowledge to be perceived as being reliable is the authority from which it is emitted, who speaks. And the thing is that on Twitter, sometimes it's very, very hard to see where it came from originally because it circulates in the way that it does. So there's an awful lot of work to be done on let's say, the structures of reliability, trust, and authority within social networks, because it places the things like tweets. I mean, I guess it's the digital versions of rumors, how they circulate, which make it very hard to know whether it's a good idea, for the environmental agencies or, even, Arizona water management, whether it's always a good idea to even try to do it via Twitter, because it's so, say, fickle, where the information ends up and via which relays on the way. So yeah, there's an awful lot to be done. So, Annelies, I don't know whether you want to say something to Pascal's comment.
No, so I've been reading more about these topics, and they were interesting research. They were published after we wrote that paper. Especially with the political ecology approach, there were people that are relying on the idea that now we're in this era of platform capitalism. So they explain how capitalism now is almost based on the functioning of those social media platforms that basically make money. And I believe that's why also Elon Musk bought Twitter, on data extraction. And the importance of social media on the spread of fake news, because the info that we see the most is the one that generates click and data circulation that can be extracted. So that's also the whole danger of those social media platforms. And there are people that are, so in the case of water uses wisely, I don't think they are in this vicious cycle of promoting on environmental messages on a platform that's actually destroying the environment. But in the case of more, other NGOs that are very much involved in fighting for climate or environmental issues, then it may be an issue for them to be on the social media too, because it's a vicious cycle of participating in a logic that for them is actually, well, destroying the environment. And I found this idea was also very interesting. In the question is, are social media a good tool to communicate on the environment? Maybe not, because they have all those, defaults or dangers.
Yeah, I mean, they're inherently irresponsible, aren't they? Without moderation. So that's the problem. So are there any more questions that you would want to talk about? Otherwise, we are getting to the end of this session. So I just wanted to say many thanks to Annelies for being here and talking to us about what she's doing. With that, I think I'll just say goodbye to all of you, and hope to see you again for the next conversation. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.